January 1940. Winter presses against the windows of a naval conference room in Tokyo. Inside, the air is warm with certainty. Chalk dust hangs above blackboards, filled with flight ranges and victory ratios. Senior aviators of the Imperial Japanese Navy speak calmly about skill about men, not machines. Their pilots have been hardened over China. Their aircraft are light, agile, lethal. Experience, they believe, is a resource that cannot be manufactured. Across the Pacific, the factories are quiet by comparison. In the United States, assembly lines are still civilian. The war feels distant. Numbers exist only on paper. In Tokyo, calculations are made. American industry is discussed, then dismissed. Mass production, some argue, produces mediocrity. An airplane built by committee cannot defeat one flown by a master. Losses can be inflicted faster than they can be replaced. No one in the room can hear the sound that will soon define the war. Not engines in the sky, but rivet guns. Stamping presses. Endless shifts under factory lights. The belief is firm. The confidence sincere. And for a brief moment in history, it will even appear justified until the arithmetic of modern war begins to speak for itself, and the world beyond that room starts to move. That confidence was shaped by years of experience, and it was not born in isolation. It grew out of a specific moment in history when the balance of air power still seemed knowable. By the late 1930s, Japanese air power rested on a foundation that appeared unshakable. For nearly a decade, aviators of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had fought an undeclared air war over China. Beginning in 1937, skies above Shanghai, Nanjing, and Hankou became classrooms of combat. Pilots learned interception, escort, and ground attack, not from manuals, but from repetition under fire. Survivors accumulated hundreds of hours in real engagements experience unmatched by any other air force on Earth. This long apprenticeship shaped doctrine. Japanese planners came to believe air superiority was not a product of scale, but of refinement. Aircraft were designed to maximize range, climb, and maneuverability. Weight was sacrificed. Armor was minimized. Self-sealing fuel tanks were considered unnecessary burdens. What mattered was that a skilled pilot, unencumbered by excess metal, could outfly and outfight any opponent before being hit at all. This philosophy produced aircraft that astonished foreign observers. Early versions of the Mitsubishi, a 6M later known as the Zero, could outrun anything they faced. Japanese pilots practiced relentlessly, drilled in formation flying and gunnery until precision became instinct. Training was selective and unforgiving. Only a fraction of candidates survived the process, but those who did were elite. Commanders viewed this exclusivity not as a weakness, but as proof of superiority. The victories reinforced belief. In China, Japanese aircraft dominated skies defended by outdated machines and undertrained crews. Losses occurred, but they were manageable. Each fallen pilot was mourned, yet replacements were drawn from a carefully cultivated pool. War, as Japanese planners understood it, was a contest of quality short, decisive, and resolved through superior spirit and technique. Industry, by contrast, was treated as a supporting actor. Japan possessed capable factories, but not infinite ones. Aluminum was precious. Skilled labor was limited. Production emphasized craftsmanship over volume. Aircraft were built in smaller numbers, often with hand-fitted components. The assumption was simple. Fewer, better machines flown by exceptional men would decide outcomes before material shortages became decisive. Across the Pacific, this outlook shaped perceptions of the potential enemy. The United States Navy and United States Army Air Corps were known entities, but largely untested. American pilots lacked combat experience. Their aircraft designs appeared heavier, slower, compromised by armor and redundancy. To Japanese observers, these were signs of caution, perhaps even fear. American industry was acknowledged but misunderstood. Planners recognized the sheer size of the U.S. economy, yet struggled to translate that abstraction into battlefield consequence. Factories, they believed, could not quickly compensate for the loss of trained aviators. An airplane without a master was only metal. Destroy the pilot, and the machine became irrelevant. This belief was not arrogance alone. It was reinforced by contemporary military thinking worldwide. Many air forces still measured strength by squadrons and aces, not output curves. The memory of the First World War lingered where industrial advantage mattered, but did not yet dominate the skies. No nation had fully demonstrated what total industrial mobilization for air war could achieve. As tensions rose in the Pacific, Japanese leadership planned for a conflict that would unfold quickly, strike hard, cripple the enemy fleet, secure resources, force negotiation before industrial weight could be brought to bear. Air power would clear the path, just as it had in China. Losses would occur, but not at a scale that threatened the system itself. What Japanese commanders could not yet see was that the nature of warfare was changing beneath their assumptions. Experience was still decisive, but only when it could be replaced. And while Japan refined men, the United States was quietly preparing to refine something else entirely: process. The stage was set by doctrine and belief. But doctrine does not exist in a vacuum. On the other side of the ocean, a very different approach to air power was taking shape, one that treated war not as an art alone, but as a problem of production. In the years before the Pacific War, the industrial landscape of the United States appeared unremarkable to foreign military observers. Aircraft factories existed, but they were dispersed. Production runs were modest. Many plants still built civilian airliners, trainers, or experimental designs in limited numbers. The country had not yet accepted the idea of total war. Mobilization plans sat on shelves, theoretical and untested. Yet beneath this calm surface lay a capacity unmatched in scale. The American economy had been shaped by mass production for decades. Automobile plants, steel mills, and electrical manufacturers had perfected standardized assembly long before aircraft became central weapons. What was missing was not ability, but urgency. That urgency began to form in 1939. As war erupted in Europe, American leaders watched carefully. The collapse of France and the air battles over Britain exposed a new truth. Aircraft losses could be catastrophic, and wars could hinge on replacement rates. In response, the U.S. Congress approved massive appropriations for aircraft expansion. New factories were planned not as workshops, but as systems designed to be replicated, scaled, and synchronized. American aviation philosophy diverged sharply from Japan's. Designers accepted that pilots would make mistakes. Aircraft were therefore built to absorb damage. Armor plates protected cockpits. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced catastrophic fires. Engines were designed for reliability rather than extreme performance. These choices added weight, but they also preserved lives. A pilot who survived one mission could fly the next. Training followed the same logic. Rather than cultivating a small elite, the United States built pipelines. Flight schools expanded across the continent. Standardized curricula replaced individual mentorship. By 1941, thousands of cadets were moving through a system designed to produce competent pilots at scale. They would not all be aces. They did not need to be. The system assumed attrition and planned for it. Factories transformed in parallel. Aircraft production was broken into components. Wings, fuselages, engines, and avionics were manufactured in separate locations, then assembled with precision tolerances. Interchangeable parts became the norm. If one factory slowed, another compensated. The goal was not perfection in each airframe, but consistency across thousands. This approach puzzled Japanese intelligence. Reports acknowledged rising American output, but struggled to assess its impact. Numbers on paper did not translate into immediate battlefield advantage. Early American aircraft still appeared inferior in maneuverability. Pilots still lacked combat experience. From Tokyo, the conclusion seemed obvious: industrial noise without tactical effect. Then came December 1941. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, abstraction ended. The United States entered the war with political unity and industrial clarity. Civilian factories were converted almost overnight. Automobile plants began producing aircraft engines. Refrigerator manufacturers stamped fuselage panels. Women filled assembly lines previously dominated by men. Production schedules stretched around the clock. Crucially, the system was designed to learn. Early aircraft were improved rapidly. Design flaws were corrected without halting output. New models entered production, even as older ones continued to roll off lines. Losses in combat triggered not hesitation, but acceleration. Every destroyed aircraft became a data point, not a deterrent. By 1942, the gap between Japanese assumption and American reality began to widen. Where Japan refined existing designs, the United States introduced successive generations. Where Japan mourned irreplaceable pilots, America rotated crews, trained replacements, and expanded the pool. Each loss was painful, but none were decisive alone. Still, this shift was not immediately visible in the skies. Early Pacific battles favored experience. Japanese pilots continued to win tactical victories, reinforcing confidence. But beneath those engagements, a different war was being fought, one measured in tonnage, man-hours, and output curves. The conflict had become asymmetric. Japan fought with excellence. The United States fought with endurance. And as both sides committed deeper into the Pacific, these two philosophies began to collide not in a single moment, but across thousands of sorties where numbers quietly accumulated. Understanding this divergence requires looking beyond strategy alone. It demands examination from multiple angles, human, technological, and psychological, where the consequences of these choices slowly revealed themselves in the air. The human equation. For Japanese airmen, war in the Pacific was intensely personal. Each pilot represented years of investment training measured not in months, but in survival. The system produced masters, but it also produced fragility. When an experienced aviator was lost, his absence echoed across the unit. Skills vanished with him. Knowledge accumulated through hundreds of combat hours could not be transferred or replaced quickly. American airmen entered a different reality. Many arrived with limited flight time and no combat experience, yet they entered squadrons designed to absorb that limitation. Missions were flown in formations that emphasized mutual protection. Losses were expected, even planned for. When a pilot failed to return, another stepped into the cockpit. The grief was real, but the system continued to move. Over time, this difference reshaped morale. Japanese pilots felt the weight of irreplaceability. Fatigue accumulated. Survivors flew mission after mission without rotation. For Americans, survival offered rest, retraining, and return. The war became not just a test of courage, but of sustainability. And as sorties multiplied, the human cost of exclusivity began to surface quietly, relentlessly, one empty seat at a time. Doctrine and collision Japanese air doctrine assumed decisive encounters. Combat would be won through superior maneuvering, quick kills, and minimal losses. This demanded aggressive tactics and close-range engagement. It worked at first. Against inexperienced opponents, agility and confidence translated into dominance. American doctrine evolved under pressure. Early defeats forced adaptation. Pilots were instructed to avoid turning fights, to use speed, altitude, and teamwork. Doctrine became flexible, shaped by feedback rather than tradition. Manuals were rewritten as lessons were learned. What failed was discarded. What worked was standardized and taught nationwide. This adaptability proved critical. Japanese doctrine remained anchored to pre-war assumptions. Aircraft design and tactics were slow to change. The belief that spirit and skill could overcome material disadvantage persisted, even as evidence mounted to the contrary. When doctrine becomes identity, adjustment becomes difficult. And as the war progressed, one side adapted faster than the other, not because it was wiser, but because its system allowed failure without collapse. Technology as philosophy Japanese aircraft embodied elegance, lightweight frames, exceptional range, remarkable maneuverability. But these strengths came with trade-offs. Damage tolerance was low. A single hit could be fatal. Survivability depended on not being struck at all. American aircraft told a different story. They were heavier, slower to turn, but resilient. Armor absorbed fragments. Fuel tanks sealed themselves after puncture. Engines kept running under damage. These machines were built to bring pilots home. As production increased, technology became iterative. New American fighters entered service with incremental improvements. More power, better armament, increased durability. Each model was not a masterpiece, but a refinement. Technology in this war was not just about performance. It was about philosophy. One side built aircraft for the perfect pilot. The other built aircraft for the average one and planned to build many of them. These contrasts did not exist in isolation. They were reinforced or challenged by leadership decisions and perceptions of the enemy, where confidence hardened into assumption. Leadership and blind spots. Japanese air leadership entered the war shaped by victory. Senior commanders had risen through systems that rewarded success in China and early Pacific operations. Their confidence was not performative, it was experiential. What had worked before was trusted to work again. This created stability, but it also created inertia. Warnings existed. Some officers noted rising American output. Others questioned pilot replacement rates. But institutional culture favored continuity. Acknowledging structural weakness risked undermining morale and doctrine simultaneously. Adjustments were incremental, cautious, often delayed until losses forced reconsideration. American leadership operated under different pressures. Early defeats created urgency rather than denial. Commanders were replaced. Tactics were evaluated brutally. There was less attachment to pre-war theory. Leadership turnover, while disruptive, allowed rapid correction. The system prioritized results over reputation. Leadership, in this sense, did not merely command, it adapted. And in modern war, adaptability became a force multiplier. Seeing the enemy clearly, Japanese intelligence assessed American industry through familiar frameworks. Production was measured against known European standards. Aircraft were counted, not replaced. Reports described factories, but struggled to conceptualize throughput. The idea that losses could be erased faster than victories could be exploited remained abstract. American intelligence, meanwhile, studied Japanese constraints, limited raw materials, finite pilot pools, long supply lines. Each insight reinforced his strategy of attrition. Victory would not come quickly, but it would come through pressure continuous, cumulative, and unspectacular. This mismatch in perception mattered. One side believed it could win before replacement mattered. The other planned explicitly to make replacement the decisive factor. By the time Japanese commanders began to grasp the scale of American output, the consequences were already airborne. Aircraft numbers rose not in increments, but in waves. Losses that would have crippled any previous air force became statistics rather than crises. The angles converged. Human endurance met industrial endurance. Doctrine met data. Leadership met limitation. And in the skies over the Pacific, these forces moved toward a moment when assumption would collide with reality. That collision would not arrive as a single shock, but as a sequence of battles where the balance shifted visibly and then permanently. By mid-1943, the air war over the Pacific entered a new Phase 1, defined less by surprise and more by arithmetic. The skies were no longer thinly contested. They were crowded, layered, continuous. What had once been isolated engagements now unfolded as daily operations, measured in sortie counts and replacement schedules. The shift became visible over the Solomon Islands. The campaign around Guadalcanal had already extracted a severe toll on experienced Japanese aviators. Victory, when achieved, came at a price that could not be paid twice. Each mission flew against mounting odds, and each loss cut deeper into a shrinking core of veterans. At the same time, American squadrons kept returning reconstituted, reinforced, and increasingly standardized. New aircraft appeared with unfamiliar silhouettes and heavier armament. Pilots who survived initial combat tours were rotated home, debriefed, and replaced by fresh crews trained on their lessons. The system fed on experience without depending on individuals to carry it alone. By late 1943, this difference became undeniable. The introduction of new American carrier fighters machines, built not just to fight, but to endure shifted engagement dynamics. Japanese pilots still outflew opponents in tight turns, but fewer battles were decided that way. American tactics emphasized altitude, speed, and firepower. Engagements began on American terms and ended before Japanese strength could be fully exploited. losses mounted. Not catastrophically in a single day, but steadily. Japanese commanders recorded numbers that were troubling, then alarming. Squadrons returned from missions incomplete. Maintenance crews worked harder to keep aging aircraft operational, even as spare parts became scarce. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours and less preparation. Training programs were shortened out of necessity, not choice. Meanwhile, American factories operated beyond earlier imagination. Aircraft that fell in combat were replaced before squadron rosters were even updated. New units formed while others fought. Production did not pause to reflect on losses. It accelerated in response to them. The industrial rhythm set the tempo of the war. This imbalance reached a critical threshold in early 1944. The appearance of massed American carrier task forces brought unprecedented air density. Where Japanese pilots once faced dozens of enemy aircraft, they now encountered hundreds across coordinated strikes. Radar-directed interception and layered combat air patrols reduced surprise. Experience mattered, but only within an environment that allowed it to be applied. Japanese commanders recognized the danger, but options narrowed. Fuel shortages limited training. Aircraft designs lagged behind the pace of American iteration. Attempts to preserve elite units clashed with the need to defend expanding fronts. The very excellence that had defined Japanese aviation became diluted, spread thin across too many demands. The turning point was not a single battle, but a realization. Attrition favored one side overwhelmingly. For every aircraft Japan lost, the replacement took longer, arrived less prepared, and carried less institutional memory. For the United States, loss triggered replenishment faster, larger, improved. By the time this pattern became fully visible, it was already self-sustaining. Air superiority began to shift from contested to assumed. Japanese pilots still fought with courage and skill, but they did so increasingly alone, outnumbered, outpaced, and unsupported by a system that could no longer keep up. The second half of this turning point would arrive when the imbalance stopped being reversible, when air power ceased to be contested at all, and became a permanent condition of the war. By mid-1944, the imbalance in the air was no longer theoretical. It was visible from every cockpit and every command map. The United States no longer fought for air superiority in the Pacific. It expected it. Operations were planned with the assumption that American aircraft would dominate the sky before the first troop landed or the first shell was fired. This reality became unmistakable during the advance across the Central Pacific. As American carrier groups pushed westward, their air wings arrived in overwhelming strength. Combat air patrols filled the sky from dawn to dusk. Japanese interception forces rose to meet them, but they did so in fragments, small groups launched from distant bases, often without adequate coordination or warning. The result was not a contest of skill, but of exposure. Japanese pilots flew into layered defenses backed by radar, radio control, and numerical depth. Engagements that once unfolded as duels now became compressions, brief, violent, and unforgiving. Losses occurred within minutes. Survivors returned to airfields already under threat from the next strike. At the same time, the quality gap reversed. American pilots who had once been inexperienced were now veterans of multiple campaigns. They flew newer aircraft with greater speed, heavier armament, and improved survivability. More importantly, They flew within a system that rewarded discipline and teamwork. Individual brilliance mattered less than coordinated execution. Japanese training pipelines collapsed under pressure. With fuel scarce and instructors lost, flight hours dropped sharply. New pilots arrived at the front with minimal preparation. Some had never fired their weapons in combat conditions. Others had never landed on a carrier before deployment. They faced opponents who had already learned, adapted, and refined their methods through thousands of sorties. Production statistics reflected the same divergence. American aircraft output reached levels previously unimaginable. Entire squadrons could be replaced in weeks. Losses that would have been decisive in earlier wars became footnotes. New models entered service faster than Japanese intelligence could evaluate them. For Japanese commanders, the realization was devastating. The premise of the war quick victory before industrial weight could be applied had failed. The weight had arrived, and it was relentless. Attempts to conserve remaining experienced pilots conflicted with the need to contest airspace. Every defensive effort consumed resources that could not be replenished. By late 1944, the skies above Japanese positions were no longer contested. They were occupied. Airfields were suppressed before aircraft could launch. Supply convoys moved only at night. Ground forces learned to live under constant threat from above. Air power, once Japan's sharpest instrument, became a defensive liability. The turning point was complete. What began as confidence rooted in experience ended as defeat defined by exhaustion. The United States did not win the air war through a single breakthrough or superior ace. It won by making loss irrelevant, by replacing every aircraft, every pilot, and every lesson faster than the enemy could absorb them. With air superiority secured, the consequences unfolded, rapidly reshaping strategy, morale, and the final trajectory of the war itself. The consequences of losing the air war were immediate and unforgiving. For Japan, air power had been the shield and the spear protecting fleets, screening islands, and striking first. Once that shield fractured, every other element of strategy became exposed. Japanese naval operations slowed to a crawl. Surface fleets could no longer maneuver freely without air cover. Convoys suffered relentless attack. Fuel shortages, already severe, became crippling as tankers were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Even when ships survived, the fear of air attack dictated movement, forcing operations into darkness and reducing coordination. On land, the impact was equally stark. Island garrisons, once reinforced by air, now found themselves isolated. Supplies dwindled. Evacuation became impossible. Soldiers learned that daylight invited destruction. Trenches deepened. Camouflage became survival. The psychological burden of constant air presence wore down resistance long before ground assaults began. For Japanese air units, the aftermath was defined by attrition without recovery. Veteran pilots were gone. Training programs could not rebuild what had been lost. Aircraft that remained were often obsolete, under-maintained, or grounded for lack of fuel. Commanders faced impossible choices: defend key positions thinly or abandon others entirely. Reports reaching Tokyo grew increasingly grim. Loss ratios, once favorable, now told a different story. Engagements ended with disproportionate casualties. Attempts to regain initiative through new tactics failed to alter the underlying imbalance. Air power was no longer a contest, it was a condition imposed from above. In contrast, American strategy expanded with confidence. Air superiority allowed planners to dictate timing and location. Amphibious assaults were preceded by systematic aerial bombardment. Reconnaissance aircraft mapped defenses with impunity. The sky became an extension of command authority. Crucially, the American system showed no signs of strain. Replacement pilots continued to arrive. Aircraft production surged into 1945. Even accidents and operational losses were absorbed without hesitation. The air war had become predictable in outcome. Japan could neither reverse nor escape. This shift also reshaped leadership psychology. Japanese commanders who had once spoken of decisive battles now planned for delay and endurance. Hope rested on political resolution rather than military recovery. Air power, once a source of pride, became a reminder of irreversible loss. The aftermath was not marked by a single surrender or announcement. It unfolded quietly across countless missions that never launched, convoys that never arrived, and defenses that could no longer be protected. The loss of air superiority did not end the war, but it ensured that every remaining battle would be fought under unequal skies. Those unequal skies would shape the final phase of the conflict, influencing not just outcomes, but the very experience of war for those who lived beneath them. As the war entered its final year, the imbalance in air power became the defining reality of the Pacific. For Japan, every strategic calculation now began with limitation. For the United States, air dominance became an assumption so reliable it shaped planning without debate. American aircraft roamed freely over contested regions. Airfields were struck before dawn and again before dusk. Supply routes were severed systematically. Reconnaissance flights operated unchallenged, turning terrain and infrastructure into mapped targets. The sky ceased to be a battlefield and became a platform. On the Japanese side, adaptation took desperate forms. Aircraft were dispersed, hidden under camouflage, or moved between bases at night. Pilots were instructed to conserve fuel, to avoid unnecessary engagement, to survive rather than dominate. But survival itself became increasingly rare. The lack of experienced instructors meant new pilots entered combat without the skills needed to do either. Production figures told the final story. American factories delivered aircraft in numbers that dwarfed Japanese output several times over. Even as Japanese industry strained under bombing and material shortages, American lines expanded. Losses in combat were offset before operational gaps could appear. The cycle of replacement became faster than the cycle of destruction. This dominance altered the human experience of war. American aircrews flew with confidence that if they were lost, they would be replaced, not forgotten, but absorbed into a system that endured. Japanese airmen flew knowing that they might be the last of their unit. Their absence felt immediately and permanently. By mid-1945, the outcome was no longer in question. Japan's remaining air power could not contest the skies, defend cities, or protect shipping. Air raids reached deeper into the homeland. The strategic consequences extended beyond military targets, affecting morale and civilian life in ways previously unimaginable. The air war had transformed warfare itself. Victory no longer depended on singular battles or exceptional individuals. It depended on the ability to sustain pressure indefinitely. The United States demonstrated that industrial capacity, once mobilized fully, could overwhelm even the most skilled opposition. For Japan, the realization was painful and irreversible. The belief that experience alone could triumph over material disparity had been tested and found wanting. The laughter that once dismissed American industry had long since faded, replaced by the quiet acknowledgement of a war fought against numbers that could not be defeated. With the conflict decided in the skies, what remained was to understand what this transformation meant, not just for the war that ended, but for every war that would follow. The air war over the Pacific did not end with a single revelation. It ended with a lesson, learned slowly and at enormous cost. It demonstrated that modern warfare had crossed a threshold where courage and mastery, though still essential, were no longer sufficient on their own. Japanese air power entered the conflict, defined by excellence. Its pilots were among the best trained in the world. Its early victories were real, earned, and undeniable. But excellence proved fragile when it could not be renewed. Skill without replacement became a finite resource, consumed faster than it could be restored. The United States approached the same war from a different premise. It assumed imperfection. It assumed loss. And it built systems designed to survive both. Aircraft were made to be replaced. Pilots were trained to be part of a cycle rather than the center of it. Experience was captured, standardized, and passed forward, ensuring that no single loss could alter the trajectory of the whole. This transformation did not diminish the human cost. Every aircraft destroyed carried lives, families, and futures with it. But it changed how war absorbed that cost. Victory became less about avoiding loss entirely and more about enduring it longer than the enemy could. The Pacific Air War revealed a new reality. Industry itself had become a weapon. Factories, training fields, and logistics networks mattered as much as dogfights and tactics. War was no longer decided solely in moments of brilliance, but in the quiet continuity of production lines that never stopped moving. For the world that followed, the implications were profound. Air power would never again be judged only by pilots or planes. It would be measured by resilience, adaptability, and scale. The conflict had shown that belief, no matter how sincere, must eventually answer to capacity. In the end, the skies did not belong to the most confident or even the most skilled. They belonged to the side that could replace every loss until loss itself ceased to matter.